Waiting for the numbers to stop climbing before we start. So nobody catches me mid-sentence. Well, welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. This lovely Tuesday afternoon. Hopefully fall is hinting that it's in the air for you wherever you are. We're so delighted that you have joined us this afternoon for one of our special afternoons at the Athenaeum programs. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. We also have with us Tess Galen, our events coordinator, who helps our programs run smoothly, and Bruce Laverty, who is our curator and will be sharing with us about theater marquees in Philadelphia, which are found in our special collection. It should be a very interesting and wonderful topic, as always, with Bruce. The Athenaeum, if you are brand new to us, is a historic library that brings together people who love books and art, our built environment and history, and being together as a community to learn and explore. We are currently closed down for renovations, but look forward to reopening with enlarged spaces for members and visitors and electrical outlets in our reading room and more, and also an improved gallery space. So if you are looking forward to coming and joining us in person, we look forward to seeing you again in November. But in the meantime, we're so pleased to have you here today with us. And I want to turn the screen over to Bruce so he can get started on his talk. Welcome, Bruce, and welcome all of you to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth. Let me just share my screen. Okay, our talk today is entitled "Behind the Marquee," which was the title of an exhibition that we had here at the Athenaeum in 1993 and 94, and it was based on a major gift that we had acquired from a donor that we'll talk a little bit more about. I'll save my explanation of the title. I'm broadcasting today from the Athenaeum boardroom. I took my glasses off because the laptop gives a very strong reflection from this particular angle, and so either I can squint or I can look like Mr. Magoo if I keep my glasses on. So let us proceed. He said. Okay. Here we go. Well, not to depress everyone from the get-go, any of you who are aware of Philadelphia's history of theater buildings are probably not surprised to see an image like this. This is the auditorium of the Stanley Theater, which was at 19th and Market Street, which was torn down in the late 1970s. And when that was torn down, in many ways, if it wasn't the end of an era, it certainly marked a sad day, but also a good day as well in terms of our knowledge of the theater industry in Philadelphia and nationwide. The Stanley Theater was the home to the Stanley Company archives. And in the offices in the back of the theater and in the lower levels were file cabinet after file cabinet of photographs and theater inventories and employee records. And a man by the name of Irving Glazer went into the building while it was being demolished and rescued about 40 cubic feet of material that would have gone into landfill had it not been for his efforts there, his extra legal and certainly dangerous efforts. I'm not recommending that anybody do that, But Irv had always had he was an accountant by trade, but he'd always had an avocation about theaters. And unlike many theater aficionados, he was not nearly as interested in what occurred or who performed on the stage and on the screen. He was much, much more interested in the buildings themselves, the theater buildings themselves. And so those rescued records went to live in his garage and his rec room in a split level in the Glazer home in Springfield, Delaware County. He organized those and became sort of the leading authority on Philadelphia theater buildings in the period from the 1960s through the 1990s. I start off this way because I think it's always important to recognize that things just don't happen to be saved. Somebody made an effort to do so. And I'm sure that if Irv could have saved the Stanley Theater itself, he would have. But failing to save the theater, he was able to save documentation, not just of this theater, but of hundreds of others throughout the country. So Irv passed away in 2004, but we very much thank you, Irv, for your efforts, not only to preserve them when you saved them the first time, but to preserve them when you presented them to the Athenaeum. So Irv is not the only person who gave us theater documents that appear in this slideshow, and so that includes the now defunct Atwater Kent Museum, the American Institute of Architects Philadelphia chapter, Samuel J. Dornsife, I mentioned Irv Glazer, Bill and Connie Hershey, Henry J. Magaziner, Evan Randolph, Robert Scaler, Edward Titleman, and George E. Thomas. That doesn't mean that these are the only folks who have given us materials that are relative to theater buildings. These are just the ones whose gifts are featured in this particular show. So it's not about one man or a single collection, but how the work of many different people over a period of decades combined to make a substantial and extraordinarily useful collection. So a little bit about nomenclature, and I use the term pre-1898 to describe the time period before there were the film age. So there were four building types for theaters, working from the high end to the low end. There were opera houses, where they were designed for the performance of opera, with special attention paid to acoustics. There were legitimate theaters, and by that we mean theaters that were primarily for the production of live plays. And there were variety and vaudeville theaters. These are theaters that were built and were managed to provide a number of different shows, sometimes as many as 20 different scheduled acts in a particular setting, which included a large variety of talents. Think of it perhaps as the old Ed Sullivan Show. There might be a singer, there might be a plate twirler, there might be a magician, there could be a musician, somebody who would do a special reading, a comic act. And so there were variety theaters. And then last of all, there was burlesque for those who wanted somewhat more naughty fun. And we'll talk about how each of these appeared in Philadelphia. Just to kind of place things, if we're looking at things like opera houses, we're looking at the Academy of Music. Legitimate theaters would be the Forest Theater or the Walnut Street or the Chestnut Street. Variety and vaudeville houses would be Keith's Theater, and burlesque, well, we'll talk about it in a minute. So film age theater types occurred in three different forms. First was the Nickelodeon, then was the movie house, And then lastly was the movie Palace. They did appear in that order, but very much so that they overlapped. Philadelphia played a major role in the creation of the film industry. Let's go back to the Academy of Music as one of the opera houses. Here is a photograph that was given to us by Evan Randolph, by Frederick Gudekunst of the American Academy of Music. It's dated from shortly after the building opened in 1857. Looking southwest across Broad Street there. You'll notice that there's still train tracks on Broad Street. Freight cars ran down Broad Street at that time, which kind of defeated the purpose of putting the Opera House so far west out in the wilderness to avoid the noise and the clamor of the city. We also have two unbuilt designs for the architectural competition for the American Academy of Music. This one is by Edwin Ferdinand Durang from 1854, and the next one is a design by our own John Notman. So on the heels of his success here at the Athenaeum in 1847, he joins another architectural competition and proposes this marble front in the Italianate style. And these drawings are here at the Athenaeum. They came to us from the Philadelphia chapter of the AIA, which acquired the John Notman drawings when Notman died in 1866 and left them to AIA founder George Hewitt. In addition to the original drawings, the Academy of Music was not just a big draw here in Philadelphia, but it got international note. And in 1882, there was a Berlin monograph that was done about the new opera house in Philadelphia. And the architects, one of the architects was Gustav Runge, who was from Germany. And this particular volume includes sections as well as plans of how the Academy was actually built. We also have material as far away as Paris. We have sources from two different donors. One is Louis Magaziner, who had this exquisite set of photographs of the Paris Opera House that were done shortly after its completion in 1875. This is just one of about 50 large format photographs. They're about 20 by 24 inches mounted and sold as a published set. Accompanying the photographs was a supplementary set which had the statuary groups of the various statues on and inside the opera house. And if you look back here to the previous page to this this horse up here, we're looking at it in detail there. And of course, the opera was designed by Charles Garnier, and we actually happen to have a portrait bust of him well, it has been moved, but it was here in the boardroom. And so that was given to us by Samuel Dornsife. So things that you might not expect to find here at the Athenaeum of international stature are here they are. So from the Paris Opera House, which is arguably the greatest opera house in the world, to the Arch Street Opera House, which was a rather grand name that was given to a building designed also by Edwin Forrest Durang in 1875. And this is a view of that building. It's on the right-hand side here at the corner of 10th and Arch, or just one door down from the corner of 10th and Arch. By that time, it was already called the Trocadero, and the Arch Street Opera House, or the Troc as it became known, was actually one of those buildings that was flexible enough throughout its career to serve all four purposes in terms of theaters. It was a legitimate theater at one point. It was an opera house. It was a variety house, and for most of the 20th century, it was best known as a burlesque theater. And one of our donors gave us this set of materials and photographs relative to the Troc that was that in the mid-20th century was the primary place for burlesque in Philadelphia. There was a weekly magazine that sort of described the burlesque circuit, the business of the burlesque circuit, and of course it was illustrated with the lovely ladies. On the cover that week was Georgia Southern, always interesting names that the ladies had. And you'll notice that the introduction for that week's magazine was by Phil Silvers, who by that time was already a film and television star. But Phil Silvers got his start as a baggy pants comedian on the burlesque circuit. Here we have inside the magazine the PG-13 rated versions of some of the ladies who were appearing at the Troc that week in 1952. One was on the right, Princess, and the one on the left was Sally Lane, who had a very interesting addition to her act there. And if you look in the back of the magazine, in the classified columns, you could contact the various agents and arrange bookings for the strippers by name. And taking a look in the back, we see that Sally Lane and her monkey, apparently they didn't separate. And it tells us, yes, the monkey is alive, and yes, it works. We don't know whether the monkey got paid or not, but apparently they came together. In the Troc, as in many theaters of the time, there was this a curtain that said asbestos on it. That word was to comfort the theater goers. It might not comfort them very much today, but it was a comfort to the theater goers in the 19th and early 20th century, because it meant that the audience, at least, was protected in the event a fire broke out on stage. And fires were very, very common in theaters of all types because of the gas and the oil lamps, and because of the sawdust, as well as the grease paint and the lack of circulation. So, in the event of a fire, that very heavy curtain made out of asbestos would drop down across the proscenium and at least give the patrons enough time to evacuate safely. And there was at least two fires in the Arch Street Opera House prior to the installation of this. This photograph would have been taken in the mid-1970s. This shows you what the lobby, the Troc was still in business as a burlesque house in the mid-1970s, and this is what the front lobby looked like just around the time that it closed. So it was pretty threadbare and pretty seedy. A far cry from the Paris Opera. In addition to the photographic documentation, as well as the publication documentation, we also have extensive files of correspondence and some drawings that talk about the restoration of this building and its reuse as a live music venue, the Trocadero, in the 1980s and 90s. So here we have, moving into the film age, we have Sigmund Lubin, who was a German lens maker whose office was over at 8th and Chestnut Street. It was on South 8th Street. And Lubin sort of single-handedly invented the film industry in Philadelphia. And it started in 1898 in a fair that was called the National Export Exposition, which was in West Philadelphia on the site of what's now Children's Hospital in University City. But in 1898, he had an exhibit there where he showed motion pictures. And because that was a special occasion, he charged a dime. Two of the pictures the films that he was showing were H.G. Wells' Trip to the Moon, one of the first dramatic pieces to be done on flexible film, and the other was a newsreel essentially, and it showed reenactments of the battles of San Juan Hill, the 1898 Spanish-American War battles, and so Lubin was a producer of films, a director of films, as well as a builder or occupier of what would become movie houses. And so these started out as nickelodeons because he charged only a nickel. Virtually anybody could go in. And what Lubin did was he spent all of the money on the outside of the building. So lots of very garish decoration and that were illuminated with hundreds and hundreds of light bulbs, so that if you were strolling down Market Street or Chestnut Street at night, you couldn't help but see these things. Once you got inside the Nickelodeon, however, what you would probably find is a white sheet hanging on a wall, a very hot projector, and either rough wooden benches or folding chairs. So it was not a comfortable or luxurious place once you got inside. But of course, you were only spending a nickel anyway. Lubin had approximately a dozen of these theaters. This one was on the 1000 block of Market Street. You can see it's just a simple commercial property that has been tarted up on the outside and is used essentially as a sign to get people in the door. A more legitimate theater on Chestnut Street is this one, which was gone by the time that Lubin came along, the Chestnut Street Theater by William Strickland. And this is a lithograph from the 1830s. This was on Chestnut, just west of 7th Street, one of 4 buildings to have the name Chestnut Street Theater. We talked about the cineograph. This building here in the Kodachrome slides of the late 1950s is the B.J. Keith's Bijou Theater. And if many of you don't remember this, it's because this building was demolished shortly after this photograph was taken by Ed Titleman. It's actually a slide. But Keith's had a variety theater. And Benjamin Franklin Keith had a nationwide chain of these theaters, and what he wanted to do in the 1890s and early 1900s was to sort of clean up the operation of variety theaters, because a lot of them sort of slid into burlesque, and what Keith wanted to do was to present programs that a married man would not hesitate to take his wife to, or even his children to. There were plenty of married men at the Troc, but Keith wanted to make sure that he was offering things that were upstanding for the family. And as film became more and more prevalent, what happened was that movies essentially became part of the variety show. If you remember, these would have also been very short as well. So Keith's Bijou Theater was the first place in Philadelphia to have projected flexible film that was actually on a scheduled program, beginning shortly after the Cinegraph opened in 1898. The theater itself was designed by John B. McElfatrick, who also designed the Metropolitan Opera House on North Broad Street. So Lubin went out of business around 1915. He went bankrupt for a lot of different reasons. Making movies was extremely expensive and extremely risky. He had a problem because making films required lots and lots of sunlight, and sunlight in Philadelphia is very fugitive. It's one of the reasons that Hollywood became Hollywood, was there was dependable sunlight in Southern California. The other problem was that he was in a war with Thomas Alva Edison about the production of movies, a war that he ultimately lost. And then, speaking of war, one of his the biggest buyers for his films in the period between 1905 and 1914 was Germany. And there was an embargo of the sales of American goods, including Lubin's films, and so Lubin ended up bankrupt. And so his company and the properties associated with it were sold at auction, and the people that bought Lubin out were the Mastbaum brothers. And if you look very closely here, I think on the next slide, there's a detail. The Mastbaum brothers and Fleischer, they were actually a real estate company. This was Jules Mastbaum and Stanley Mastbaum. They bought Lubin's theaters, and for a time they considered the idea that they would continue to make movies, but they saw the writing on the wall that was a money loser. But they decided to concentrate on the buildings themselves, and rather than just having fancy exteriors, that they would make lavish interiors that people would want to go and stay in for the sole purpose of viewing movies, or the primary purpose of viewing movies. So the Carlton was on Chestnut Street, actually still is, on the 1400 block. It's around 1416. In the 1950s, it was renamed the Midtown, and all of the Victorian appearance of that front facade was covered up with corrugated steel, and then which served as a great backdrop for the wonderful neon. And so this is the thing that strikes me about this image, which is a Jacob Stellman image from around 1952, is that not only do you have the word Midtown spelled out in neon, which would make perfect sense, but the movies are actually also in neon, which meant that every time they changed the movie, the neon sign got changed, which had to have been incredibly expensive, but it must have paid for them. The building survives today. Its most recent incarnation was the Prince Theater on Chestnut Street, and this is the first theater that I ever remember going to downtown. When Mary Poppins was released in 1964, we went down. My mother and my brother and cousins and I went down there. And the line was all the way from the front door here down in front of the Union League. And I remember we waited for hours, what seemed like hours, and they were sold out by the time we got to the box office. And I was amazed that my mother decided to take us back the very next night. So we got to see Mary and Bert. So the Stanley Theater was built in 1923 at the corner of 19th and Market, the southwest corner. It was named for Stanley Mastbaum, who by that time had died, and so his brother Jules, who took over the company. Oh, by the way, when the Mastbaum brothers bought out the Lubin company, it became the Stanley company, and so Jules built the Stanley as a memorial to his late brother, and this is actually a piece of sheet music. It's a waltz ballad, and it's featured by the Stanley Theater Symphony Orchestra. So this was one of about a half a dozen theaters in the city that not only had an organ, but or an ensemble, but had a 100-piece orchestra that played played for the scores of the silent films at that time, but also played in between the shows. And getting back to Herb Glaser, he had a connection with the Stanley Theater as well. In the 1940s, he went to went to there to apply for a job as an usher. And he had come from school and he didn't have his glasses on, and he got the job. And when he showed up the first day for work, he was wearing his glasses, and they said, "You can't wear glasses. It's not in the uniform." And he said, "Well, I can't see without my glasses." And they said they fired him on the spot. And so he didn't lose his love for the theater or that one in particular. It also gives you an idea of the kind of control that that management had in those days over their employees or prospective employees. So here's the Stanley in the 1950s with War and Peace, and in these days, the draw of the theaters brought lots and lots of people into town from all over the city, and then they would often stay here and eat, or stores would be open late and they would shop on Market Street and on Chestnut Street as well. This is one of Bob Scaler's postcards, a color image of the interior of the Stanley Theater from about 1919. The Fox Theater, which was at the corner of 16th and Market, this is an image that shows the first incarnation of a theater building to incorporate an office tower inside of it. And so the theater would have just been on the first floor, and there was this large Gothic tower that had been proposed by C. Howard Crane of New York City. This one was not built, but there was a much more restrained tower that was built as an office tower. That way, in addition to making money at the theater, it also made money from the rentals of the offices. This is the basement lounge of the theater, the Spanish lounge, as they called it, and it just seems to sort of go on for acres in lush carpet and brocaded roofs there around the columns. This view from 1959 shows the south side of Market Street. And one of the great things about these images when you're trying to date a particular photograph is when you've got the marquees that have the movies on them. You can just see exactly when the movie came out, and you get a pretty good date. But you see here on the 1600 block of Market Street, where a high-rise building is today, there were actually 4 different theaters. The Fox, right next door to it, was the Stanton. A few more down, few more doors down was the Studio Theater, a smaller theater, and then the Center Theater just beyond that. So that on the block between 16th and 17th and Market and Chestnut, there were 12 theater buildings in operation in 1960. The Boyd Theater opened on Christmas Day in 1928, and this was the first theater in Philadelphia to be built to have talking pictures sort of built in. And this marvelous neon sign, the vertical neon sign here, was immediately axed by the newly formed Philadelphia Art Commission, which said that it violated the zoning codes for Chestnut Street, and so that was lost very, very quickly. The Boyd Theater became central to a major court case in the late 1980s and 1990s concerning historic preservation in Pennsylvania. And there was a nomination for this theater that was based primarily on the interior of the building. and it went all the way to the Supreme Court and favored against our preservation law here in Pennsylvania. And the preservation code actually had to be modified, and we had to write into the code that interiors could be designated. But the owners were arguing that it was an unlawful taking for the government to say that you couldn't do something with the historic interior. This theater has been fought over for about 40 years, and it had a marvelous interior, which I'll show you a couple of pictures of. But it has been saved, but basically just the facade. And if any of you have ever been inside the Boyd, you realize the facade is not nearly, doesn't nearly begin to tell the story. So here's a view of the auditorium, and notice the scalloping of the proscenium here. The mural above the proscenium has sort of stylized Art Deco version of the history of womankind, disguising the organ console. These photographs were taken by Mike Seneca when we were over at a protest at the theater in 2004. And so it gives you an idea of the kind of color tile work that was available, as well as the ornate interior work that had survived, well, at least 60 years at that time. Is the water fountain. And here you get an idea of some of the color of that scaffolding. Thank goodness that they didn't have the effort or the expense to go up and paint over that decoration of that scalloping. It's a moot point now because that was all demolished as part of the redevelopment. This was also the first theater to have Cinerama, which was a widescreen technology that came out in the 1950s to try to unsuccessfully try to steal away viewers from their television sets. The largest of Philadelphia theaters ever, legit or movie or otherwise, was the Mastbaum Theater. It was originally designed as the Jules, but in 1929, the year that it was scheduled to open, Jules Mastbaum died. And so they renamed it the Mastbaum Theater for the entire family. This building had almost 5,000 seats. It was located at the northwest corner of 20th and Market Streets. The architects were Hoffman and Heenan Company, who had designed a number of the other theaters for the Stanley Company. And it was unique in a number of ways. Not only with its lavish adornment, but it actually had marquees and entrances on three different blocks, three different street faces. So you could go in through Market Street, you could go in through 21st Street, and you could go in through what was then known as Pennsylvania Boulevard, now JFK Boulevard. And there is Jules Mastbaum. When he died in 1926, not in 1929. But Mastbaum's other major contribution to the city was his collection of Rodin sculpture, and the Rodin Museum on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which opened in 1929, the same year as the Mastbaum Theater, was known as the Jules Mastbaum Foundation. Here's a view of it when it was brand spanking new. And one of the reasons I left some of the captions at the top that were in these photographs. And by the way, this is one of the photographs that Irv rescued from the Stanley Theater while it was under demolition. But the company used these to identify the theaters for insurance purposes. So this is the Mastbaum lobby number 4. And the elevator bank. This was the only theater in the city to have an elevator in 1929, and it had 4 lobbies. And unlike Lubin, where a lot of the decorations were almost like paper mache, this is all carved and gilded woodwork as well as marble. And so here is this is actually the Earl Theater. Pardon me, we'll get to that. Here's the Mastbaum Theater. It actually had 4 tiers of seating, and this had a 200-piece orchestra that played in between the shows. There's the opposite side. Here's their basement lounge, which was complete with a fireplace. I can't imagine a fireplace in a movie theater, but sure enough, there it was, and plenty of places where there were both ashtrays as well as spittoons. But the Mastbaum was like a lot of its partners, was relatively short-lived. 29 years. This view is of the Pantano Demolition Company, which in 1958 was assigned to demolish the theater. So that's Mr. Pantano sitting there. When the theater was marked for demolition, the Metropolitan Museum of Art came down and bought a lot of the crystal and bought a lot of the decoration, and it is now at the Met. Just 1 block west of the Mastbaum was the Erlanger Theater. This is a view from 1966 from the opening of Man of La Mancha. Down on the east side of Broad Street, we had the Earl Theater, which in this construction photograph, interestingly enough, was billed as the El Rey Theater. And the reason for the El Rey is that the investors behind the theater were relatives of Governor George Earl of Pennsylvania, and they didn't think it was seemly that the governor's name should be on a theater building. But by the time the theater was done, he thought that was just fine. So they gave up that fig leaf of misdirection there. This was at the southeast corner of 11th and Market Street, another example of a theater building with an office building built on top. This is the lobby there in the Earl, and the mezzanine, and lobby number 3. And there's the proscenium arch at the Earl. The Earl became not only a movie venue, but a major venue for live performances. And in the 1940s and 50s, acts like Frank Sinatra and Martin and Lewis, Johnny Ray, and others would perform there to enormous crowds. This was the Marquee on Market Street, and 90 minutes of terrifying action with Robert Taylor. Suspense the shock, stir the thrills. Down on South Street on the 1500 block is the Royal Theater, built around 1927. And the Royal Theater very quickly became a major center for the African-American community, both as patrons as well as operators. In fairly recent times, the theater had been purchased by Kenny Gamble, by Gamble and Rogers. Its fate is still somewhat uncertain, but one of the few theater buildings that remains relatively intact in the city in terms of the days of the golden age of movies. In the Glazer collection, this interesting flyer was also included, and it had to do with an attempt to unionize the Negro operators of the Royal Theater, and so it says that the beauty of the theater, the finest entertainment, and the courteous service has won the Royal the title of the America's finest colored photoplay house, and so it played a major role in the entertainment community as well as the employment community in the African American neighborhood surrounding South Street and Christian Street. And there's the demolition of the Earl Theater. In addition to some of these downtown palaces, there were satellite palaces. By palace, I mean a theater that was built to show movies primarily, and one that had more than 1,000 seats. There were lots and lots of theaters that had less than 1,000 seats, but if we use that terminology or that trigger mark, there were about a dozen palaces in the city. One was called the Circle Theater, which was on Frankfurt Avenue in Frankfurt. There's another Hoffman and Heenan design. Here's a wonderful image of how the architects make the design look as good as possible. And there was nothing really wrong with the design, but location is everything. And of course, this is where the Circle Theater was built. And the L was already had already been up for 7 years when those designs were done. So the circle there was underneath the L. It was not made to not made for show, but for convenience of the crowds that would be coming to it. And the elevated station was less than half a block away. The other unique thing about the Circle Theater is that it was what's called an atmospheric theater. This is a view of the auditorium, and the ceiling was actually a concave shape that came down behind this sort of false Spanish garden along the wall. And there was a special machine that would project starlight or clouds on the ceiling, and the stars in the clouds actually moved when the lights went out. And in the flora along the sidewalls too, there were mechanical birds that would tweet as the starlight went by. The only other atmospheric theater in Philadelphia or the Philadelphia area was the Tower Theater at 69th Street. This is not in our collection, but boy, do I wish it was. It shows the Randolph Theater on Chestnut Street. This was on the 1100 block of Chestnut on the south side. It's from July 4th of 1952, and we can only assume that the photographer, this was from the Bulletin Archive at Temple University. We can only assume that the photographer had been waiting all morning to get this snapshot of Vice President Richard Nixon right under the marquee that said it came from outer space. So back to the Stanley. The demolition there and demolition there. Let's go to the Uptown. The Uptown Theater is on North Broad Street, designed by Magaziner and Eberhardt and Harris. Like the Circle, it was built in 1929. There were 3 of these satellite theaters that were built the same year as the mass bomb, all by the Stanley Company, all with well over 1,000 seats. So the Uptown was another example, a neighborhood example of a high-rise office building that was built on top of the theater. Its timing of the opening just after the completion of the Broad Street subway made for an interesting feature of this theater, in that you could get direct access to the theater from the subway platform below. And in 2019, the Athenaeum did a couple of hard hat tours of the Uptown, and so we got to take a peek into those subway entrances. So 1929, this also had a national impact. It made the cover of Construction Magazine. And in the opening night program from February of 1929, which we have a copy of here in the Magaziner collection, we have this spread that shows the opening night order of program, but then Louis Magaziner, the architect himself, wrote this page on the new art. And this was one of the first of the theater buildings in the city to use Art Deco. It's a wonderful essay. But what Magaziner does was essentially places the motion picture theater building, one that showed talking pictures, as right in the middle of American and modern technology that included wonders such as radio and air travel. And interestingly enough, there's one paragraph in here that I always like to quote. And it said, it may be conceded that the Playhouse of the Palace of Autocracy is the playhouse of democracy, where royalty, deemed as its own particularly ordained right to revel in the creative beauty of its artists and craftsmen, democracy is now privileged to enjoy such creations for its hours of leisure. And so Magaziner was saying, look, the average person who pays a dime or a quarter or 50 cents to see a movie and a newsreel and a cartoon and other pieces of the program, they deserve to have a beautiful place as well. And the only places that would compare for an average working person in terms of being able to go to on a regular basis to see such luxury and such beauty would be houses of worship. Certainly not their workplaces. And so it really is very telling in terms of what the mindset was in 1929 and how the theater building, which was a new building type, the movie house, which was a new building type, fit into American architecture. Here's a photograph of the Uptown from the 1970s. In the 1960s and 70s, the Uptown Theater became a major center for Black entertainment, and both in terms of movies and live shows. And here you see on the marquee that the Miracles, Mary Wells, the Marvelettes, Marvin Gaye, the Supremes. This is a pretty good lineup in around 1960, 1965 here. The Uptown has had a number of very dedicated people over the years trying to revive it. We were very, very sad to note the loss of Linda Richardson, who was the latest person to sort of spearhead that work. But the Uptown is really the only survivor of the movie palace age that is relatively intact. It's not in great shape inside, but if we were to revive a single theater in Philadelphia, and almost every other city has done that with at least one movie palace, this would be the one to do it. Here is the Midway Theater, the sort of the last of the age of the movie palaces. Opened in 1932 at Kensington and Allegheny. That's our poster from our exhibit poster from 1994. And this is also designed by Magaziner Eberhart and Harris. And here you see this is not a steamship. It's not a stage set for a Busby Berkeley musical. This is the lobby for a motion picture theater in the heart of the Factory District in Kensington. The other major theater of that satellite, the neighborhood satellites, was the State Theater out at 52nd and Chestnut Streets. And here you have a 1950 image. I looked up to see when King Solomon's Mines was released, Deborah Carr and Stuart Granger. And so we know that the photographs from 1950. And the other interesting thing about this is the billboard that was on top. You had the Randolph, the Midtown, and the Goldman, all owned by the Goldman theaters. We can only assume by that time the state was also owned by the Goldman Group, and they called it Tops in Entertainment on the Gay White Way, which is kind of interesting because the Randolph and the Midtown were both on Chestnut Street. The Goldman Theater itself was not quite on Chestnut Street. The State Theater had a wonderful Art Deco facade there, designed by Ralph Benker. After World War II, in 1946, the Goldman Theater was the first motion picture theater in America to be completed. It was at the corner of 15th and Randstead, so directly across the street from City Hall. Notice there that it says air conditioned. Motion picture theaters were among the earliest to be air conditioned, some starting as early as the 1930s. And many people in the time before domestic air conditioning was widely available could go to the movies and spend an entire day and half the night there in cool comfort, because for one admission fee, you got to stay as long as you wanted it. We have some paperwork here at the Athenaeum that indicates what they did in the days before there was air conditioning in the theaters, where the ticket sales would usually slump. And the operators of the theater it was recommended to them that they replace the white interior light bulbs with blue, because blue made people feel cooler. That they give away free ice water to quench the thirst of the patrons. And that they fired the first usher who says, "Ain't it hot?" So this is not a theater building, but it is a building that we lost. And so we could recount all of the buildings that have come down, and all of these buildings that had a fairly short lifespan because they either were not productive, that society had changed, or that styles had changed. And it reminds me of a story. Back in the 1970s and 80s, there was a TV personality on CBS, and he had a Sunday morning program. His name was Charles Kuralt. And his weekly feature was called On the Road with Charles Kuralt. And what he did was he had an RV, and he went around all around the country, and he would stop in various small towns and talk with people and have a featured story about a person or a family or a particular small town. It was an extremely popular feature. And after Charles Kuralt passed away, they gave the RV to the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan, which made perfect sense. And I shortly after this happened, a representative of the Henry Ford Museum was speaking at the American Museum Association meeting here in Philadelphia. And I happened to be at that session. Yeah, progress immediately above my head. I happened to be at that session, and someone had said, "Well, you know, that's a large and unwieldy piece to maintain for the museum." And the curator said, "Oh well, as soon as there's nobody alive who remembers it, we'll get rid of it." And I was I was really taken aback by that idea, that as soon as a human memory of a particular time or a particular event or series of events is gone, then it's okay to erase it. And it seemed to me that particular person had things backwards, in that it's our responsibility as museums and libraries and archives to maintain things for when people no longer can remember. And so, you know, you have a person like Irv Glazer, who went in and rescued these things. He didn't do them completely for himself. He managed to pass them down to another steward, so to speak. And so this is a flyer that we developed many years ago. It shows the demolition of the Provident National Bank, which was a Frank Furnace Bank on the 400 block of Chestnut Street. Penny Batchelor of the National Park Service took this image just as Wrecking Ball hit the arch there in 1960. But even for those buildings that are lost, we can't necessarily save every building, but in many cases we can save the documentation and preserve the memory for the time when the memory is gone. Thank you very much.
So I hope you all had a wonderful time, and I unfortunately have to jump off for a 1 o'clock meeting, but Bruce would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. If you can put them in the chat or Q&A box, he will follow.
Bruce, can you read the Q&A questions, or do you want me to read them?
How about if you read them?
Okay. Let me see. I'm going to pick this one first because it's also my question. That Nickelodeon theater you showed, is that still there? And if not, what is there?
The gallery. Well, the fashion district.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was such a pretty building. It's such a shame. I really liked that one.
They were there. The Nickelodeons were very, very short-lived. I mean, they had about a 10-year span, and when Lubin was gone, so were they.
I'm embarrassed.
And people were not satisfied to just go in on and sit on benches anymore.
I'm embarrassed to say I did not know that Nickelodeon was a type of theater. I thought it was just a television channel for children. So.
Right. Well, no,
I didn't know that word.
Yeah, and again, it was designed to be affordable to anybody.
Yeah.
So.
Let's see. So the question: what theater was used for the 3-screen Cinerama in Philadelphia? Rob says he remembers going there with his family to see how the West was won.
Cinerama was introduced at the Boyd. Whether they installed it anywhere else, I'm not sure, but it was introduced at the Boyd.
A lot of these questions are very long, so I have to read them.
While you're reading them, actually, let me make a couple of points. Why did the theaters disappear? There are a couple of major points you should be aware of. One, in 1948, there was a court case, United States versus Paramount, and essentially it was an antitrust case. And in those days, the studios not only owned the films and produced the films, but they also owned the theaters. The Stanley Company merged with Warner Brothers, and for most of the time that these theaters were around, it was the Stanley Warner Company. Well, this 1948 case essentially said you cannot own the theater and the film producing end, so you can't work both ends of it. So it separated production from exhibition, which weakened the industry, because they couldn't kind of shove promotion in one area and to certain theaters. And so it weakened the industry. So that was one, the first nail in the coffin. The second, of course, it was television, and so that while going to the movies was relatively inexpensive, television was free. And as the baby boom increased, if you had 2 or 3 or 4 kids at home, that needed to have a babysitter, then you could just plop them all in front of the TV instead of taking them all to the movies. And then as times changed in the 1960s, in particular with the growth of suburbia and the increase of crime or perceived crime in the downtown areas, people were less likely to go downtown, particularly after dark. And so that was kind of a triple threat: the antitrust case, television, and suburbanization, and the fear of downtown.
Let's see here. So someone from Chicago mentioned they also have an Uptown theater there.
Yes, they do. And I had to be careful not to put any of their pictures. Irv collected photographs from all the Stanley Company owned theaters all over the country,
Okay.
including, I think, the Uptown. And so he was a very good organizer. And so thankfully that organization was retained here. But as I was just browsing the Uptown Theater photographs, I had to make sure I didn't put the wrong Uptown.
That's good to know. I didn't know we had those in there because I do love those Uptown photos. So they also mentioned they found Uptown theaters in Kansas City, DC, Napa, Port Townsend. So some of those at least would have been the same organization.
Well, maybe yes, maybe
but-
no. I mean, it's a fun name.
Right. Generic name, kind of.
So it's not necessarily the same organization. If it came from the Glazer collection, it was pretty certain to have been a Stanley Company theater because that's what he saved, quotation marks. So.
So someone mentions that the most beautiful theater they ever saw was the Stanley Theater in Jersey City. Would that have been the same as well?
Yeah, if it was named Stanley, it was a Stanley Company theater. Yeah. And there was a Stanley Theater in Atlantic City too, I think.
Do we have any documentation on the Fairyland Theater, 1300 block of Market, opened circa 1906?
So, I've concentrated on the pictures here because they're pretty, but Irv collected everything. So he had inventories from the various theater buildings. Whenever there was a news clipping, he would clip that out. He would clip things out of Exhibitor magazine saying that such and such a theater had changed its policy and it was going to a first run from a second run. So they're all arranged by state and then city and then alphabetically within that. So if he's interested for a non-Philadelphia, the Philadelphia theaters are all listed on PAB. We have at least 10 of the best images from each file have been scanned for the Philadelphia theaters, but there are probably 5,000 theater buildings that he has information on. And the other thing that we have in the collection, which we're almost coming to a time where we can release them publicly, we have employee cards from the Stanley Warner Company, both the interview cards where people were turned away for reasons of like they wore glasses or they were the wrong race or religion, and then the employees. The Stanley Company also employed security / spies to keep an eye on the box office workers and the candy vendors, and to make sure nobody was letting their friends into the theater and that they weren't undercharging for the milk duds. And there's some nasty commentary in some of those files, which I wanted to keep them. They close around 1954 or so. So I want to have a 75-year limit on there because could be somebody's grandmother or grandfather.
Yeah, that'd be really cool to see. A lot of people are asking if you can make at least a guess for how many theaters there would have been at the highest peak.
Well, Irv was a stickler on numbers, and he wrote a book called Philadelphia Theaters A to Z in the early 90s. It was just text. So there were 804 theater buildings in Philadelphia between the founding of the city and 1980. So that includes legitimate theaters, that includes nickelodeons, that includes everything. But so at the high point, which would have been in the late 1920s, you're probably looking at about 250 motion picture theaters. And so there, it wasn't just palaces. There were big ones and there were small ones in all of the neighborhoods. And the interesting thing was that the major building of theaters stopped with the Depression. But ironically, the attendance in motion picture theaters increased during the Depression because it was one of the few affordable recreations, and also it provided an escape So, people would go and watch Shirley Temple, everybody, A Perfect Child, and, and she always ended up being rich. She starts out poor and she ends up being rich, and who doesn't like a story like that? Or complete fantasy like the Busby Berkeley musicals or the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, where they just want to be taken away from, the news of the day.
Looking
So
at people's comments, everyone is talking about, the theater that was near them, movie they remember seeing. Everyone has these great stories. And I can even think of stories like my parents have told me about my dad's first job was at a theater. So he could see in Lawrence of Arabia like 100 times. One of my parents' first dates was to see Star Wars. So theaters really have a really important part in our lives. And it's interesting for me, when I think of the theater, I do not think of the things that are shown in those photographs.
Well, my mother and father had their first date around 1947 in the Midway Theater. So I owe that theater a debt of gratitude, I guess.
Well, there's still lots of comments sort of coming in, but it is 1:10. People need to get back to work, I'm assuming. This was recorded. It'll be up on our YouTube channel probably next week sometime, so if you want to look for it there. And we are getting Bruce ready for his next one of these programs sometime in October, so keep an eye out for that. The Athenaeum is still closed for renovations. All those noises you heard in the background, we are not being demolished ourselves, just renovations. At least we're not planning on any demolition.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get a little nervous when I'm there, but we will be open in the fall. So we hope you all come visit. You can set up a research appointment and see all those photographs in person. So thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.